Welcome to an extra special edition of Your Daily Detroit for Friday, April 3rd, 2020. Today, we take you away from your stay-at-home coronavirus blues to travel halfway across the globe to Minsk, Belarus. It's one of Detroit's 7 sister cities, and it's a place that's been in the news lately as the only country in Europe that is continuing to play professional soccer and admit fans to stadiums. That's thanks to its authoritarian president, who's downplayed the pandemic and instead recommended citizens drink vodka, visit Russian saunas, and work on a farm to stay healthy. It's also where I was recently invited to discuss the work we do at Daily Detroit at the Press Club Belarus. It's an organization that promotes an independent, free press in the former Soviet Republic. What follows is a travelogue of sorts to a place most Americans know little about. So fasten your seatbelts, keep your passports handy, and enjoy your flight. I'm Sven Gustafsson.
Yeah, moving forward, for instance, like Starbucks can open, can be opened, or anything else. But still people, or Apple Pay, but thing is that people still understand now that, they have these things, Starbucks, H&M, Apple Pay, but the life itself hasn't changed.
That's Alexei Shuntov, translating the Russian of Sergei Sakharin, the editor-in-chief of CityDog, a digital news website in Minsk. We'll come back to them later. But first, let's set the table for Belarus. It was a gray Sunday in November when I arrived in Minsk, the capital of Belarus and its largest city. It was also election day for the national parliament. Elections in Belarus aren't like the ones here in the US. I didn't see any yard signs or other obvious giveaways for starters, and as I soon learned, many people simply stay home. That's because elections in Belarus are widely regarded as fraudulent exercises for show. There's no transparency in how votes or turnout are counted. An international watchdog group monitoring the election would later report more than 650 violations of electoral law. How many people actually come out and vote for an election like this?
No one knows.
That's Pavel Sverdlov, editor-in-chief of Euroradio.fm. It's an independent news site in Minsk that streams 5 days a week.
There is an official number. It is 77. It's a little more than 77% of people. But no one believes it from people who were observing these elections because they saw that there was no such a lot of people. And sometimes then you are lucky to take photo of sheets with signatures of people who come to vote, and you see there is no signature on your sheet. You are the first from 15 maybe person on this sheet who came to vote, and it's not 77%.
No one from a block of 7 opposition candidates focused on issues of importance to young Belarusians was elected to parliament. But one person who was? Miss Belarus 2018, a woman named Maria Vasilevich, who's often seen with the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko.
She is very often with Alexander Lukashenko on different kinds of shows, on hockey match, when Lukashenko collects potato in his farm, etc. She's near him and near his son.
Sverdlov said that 32 incumbents took part in the election, and just 2 were not re-elected. One was believed to be ill. The other candidate? Well, it wasn't so clear that he was connected to the Lukashenko regime at all, which is key to winning an election in this country.
He's from private party, like a Belarusian Patriotic Party. It's a pocket party. We hear about such parties just during the elections, when our government wants to show to Europe that in our parliament there are representatives from different parties, different political parties,
like we're diverse. We're not they want to...
that there is a diversity. So he's one of these pocket parties. He's the head of that party, and something happened wrong, and he's not re-elected. We will call him and ask why is it so. This is elections in Belarusian parliament.
So that's a little primer on politics in Belarus, a country that has been independent since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It's been living under the authoritarian rule of Lukashenko, its first and only elected president since 1994. But I should first back up and explain how I ended up in Minsk. Last year, a group of young journalists from Belarus traveled to Detroit as part of the sister cities relationship, which dates back to 1979. Jer and I met with them to talk about Daily Detroit with the help of a Russian translator. That led to an invitation to come to Minsk from Mykolai Anashenko, the director of Press Club Belarus. He said he was working with the U.S. Embassy in Minsk to make it happen. I still pinch myself that of all the much bigger mainstream media outlets they met with, they picked us, Daily Detroit, to come to Minsk, an old city of around 2 million people in far eastern Europe, some 4,600 miles away. Despite nearly 30 years of independence from Russia, Belarus remains heavily dependent on its massive neighbor for its economy. Huge chunks of it, like agriculture and industry, remain under government control, with state-owned entities comprising around 3/4 of the nation's GDP. I visited a state-owned bookstore one day that had calendars and posters bearing Lukashenko's portrait, casting a watchful eye over shoppers. A Google search on Belarus turns up lots of stories about government crackdowns and arrests of protesters and journalists. The organization Reporters Without Borders ranks Belarus number 153 out of 180 countries in its most recent World Press Freedom Index. That's a few slots behind even Russia. Lukashenko's hardline rule has earned Belarus the label as, quote, the last dictatorship in Europe. It's a term that rankles many young Belarusians who are eager to move beyond associations with the Soviet past. At the border inspection, the agent reviewing my passport asked me why I was there. I told him I was a guest of the Press Club Belarus, and I swear he winced. Then he shuffled a few documents, stamped my passport, and slid it back to me. I was free to enter the country. I was interviewed for the Press Club Belarus podcast, and I was asked to name some similarities between Detroit and Minsk, so I'll share a few. Beyond the similarly dismal, cold winter weather, I was quickly struck by how many wide, American-style roads there were in Minsk. Although the city has terrific public transit, and more on that in a moment, there was clearly a car culture here. And like Detroit, Minsk is a poor, post-industrial city with many signs of revitalization, or gentrification if you want to call it that. My hotel was right off Kastrichniskaya Street, a former industrial strip dotted with trendy new bars and restaurants, along with many incredible murals. It reminded me of Eastern Market here in Detroit. But other parts are a lot like any other old European capital city, with wide, bustling sidewalks, classical mid-rise buildings, lots of coffee shops, and consistently good food. The Svislash River winds its way through the city and a network of lovely parks. Then there's the public transportation. Minsk is served by several different kinds of buses, a trolley, and an excellent subway system built by the Soviets starting in the 1970s. It's small, just 2 lines with a third under construction. But the stations are clean and filled with interesting ceramic tile work, mosaics, and other public art. And the subway is scary efficient. I don't think I ever waited more than 2 or 3 minutes for a train to arrive. Still, other parts of the city were quiet at night. Too quiet, it seemed, for a city of its size. On a Friday night, I met some locals at the packed TNT Rock Club in the Old Town section of Minsk. A local Arctic Monkeys tribute band was playing, along with a cover band playing everything from Chuck Berry to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. If you want to see big headlining acts, you have to go to Moscow or other European cities. Outside of some signs advertising a big show by the Scorpions, touring bands mostly skip Minsk because the country is poor and it's not considered a good draw. Belarus is heavily dependent on subsidies from Russia, just as it was throughout its Soviet history. It turns out there's a growing tech sector in Minsk. EPAM, a global software developer that is traded on the New York Stock Exchange, got its start in the city. Minsk is also home to Wargaming, makers of a popular tank multiplayer video game. In 2016, Facebook bought a Minsk-based startup called Masquerade. It makes Snapchat-like virtual photo effects and filters.
My name is Anatoly Babienya. I'm a member of local hackerspace. It's basically what keeps me alive and interested in doing things.
I met Anatoly at the Press Club. He told me that Minsk was once home to many Soviet-era semiconductor plants for radios and TVs. His parents worked in them, he said, and say that another plant was under construction when the USSR broke apart.
It was like microchips that was designed like an Intel ones, but
Intel,
yeah. The same architecture, but produced completely by Soviet Union. When Soviet Union was falling apart, this plant was being built and it was going to produce these computers using like a new architecture for Soviet citizens. But because of the breakage, we could not like complete it. When Soviet Union fell apart, like basically like people stole all the equipment because there was no like order, nothing like usually happens. And it never recovered.
Babinya says the technology that survives is mostly writing software for other companies, rather than the kind of robust engineering from the Soviet era. The semiconductor plant was apparently never completed. And even if it was, Intel by then was already building semiconductor plants in Asia to take advantage of cheap labor. A bustling manufacturing industry sent off to other countries, that's a storyline we know well here in Detroit. So all this technology is sort of lost.
I would say the engineering culture is probably lost, but there is still one generation, but after this generation, it will be completely lost. There are still people who know how to build things, how to design things, how to, I would say, copy things, because it still was an arms race, and also in computer science, it was the race was probably lost, but there is still like a lot of people were inspired by computer science.
So is anybody encouraging that generation to share their knowledge?
No, nobody. Like nobody have the time and the money and the power to go and record interviews with this older generation. How do they try to make all of this and try to make it interesting for the new generation? Because for the younger people, these stories of engineering, they're still too boring, because they're speaking about Soviet Union.
It's not sexy.
Yeah, right. It's not sexy.
I met Sergei Sakharan, the City Dog editor and co-founder, at a bustling coffee shop that shares space with a fancy jewelry shop. City Dog is a digital lifestyle magazine aimed at the creative class and young IT workers. City Dog launched in 2012, initially to reflect the desire of many hip young Belarusians to be more like Western Europe. But it has increasingly shifted its focus to issues like ethnic minorities, healthcare, and people. Popular stories include a look at Amy Winehouse's Jewish ancestry in Minsk, profiles of young Belarusians who relocated to Poland, and a story about a Japanese man who's been living in Minsk for 2 decades.
Ищешь человека из этого же класса, да, то есть либо человека, который понимает нужды.
Yeah, so it's pretty hard to find a good employee who is quite aware of the sector, because usually they are either working in the sector, for instance, in PR service, or they're programmists. Yeah, so it's very difficult to find people to get them work for you to write like texts about the sector because they have higher salaries working for the IT sector itself.
I asked him what kind of effect the growing numbers of tech employees are having on life in Belarus.
У нас-то тоже эйджизм, ну, в этом смысле, если говорить про конторы, как относятся в компаниях,
Yeah, so as far as IT sector is concerned, yeah, the ageism is growing there. Yeah, they may say that like you are experienced, that's nice. But as far as work is concerned, they may just like, for instance, Sergey is 40 years old, and for him, it's already a problem to get into the IT sector, yeah, to work for IT sector because of the age.
в этом только один — самому создавать рабочие места.
So there is only one way out, is to create working places yourself.
It's also led to huge income disparities between generations.
Смотри, 3000 он получает.
Yeah, so guy from IT sector receives 3 times higher salary than a senior citizen here in Belarus. So the gap is very, very big.
Throughout its long history, Belarus was alternately part of Ukraine, Poland, and what is today known as Lithuania. Half of modern-day Belarus became part of a forerunner to the USSR in 1919, while the rest was absorbed following World War II. Today, signs of the country's past are hard to miss. There's a huge sculpture of former Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin in front of the Parliament building. The old hammer and sickle flag still flies over the city's excellent museum on the history of World War II, which it calls the Great Patriotic War. That's a time when Minsk was almost completely destroyed by the Nazis. And communist icons appear on plaques all over the city's many parks and monuments. Tellingly, I had an interesting experience trying to find souvenirs to bring home for my sons. At one souvenir shop, a man eagerly showed me lapel pins featuring the busts of Lenin and Joseph Stalin, which, he assured me, were very popular. It would prove difficult to find a simple t-shirt with the name Minsk on it, as if in this simple task, I had run up against the limits of Belarus's open economy. Recently, relations with Russia have become more complicated. Belarus refused to recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea in Ukraine in 2014, and Russia in January began suspending oil shipments to Belarus. Fears that Vladimir Putin may want to annex Belarus have led to public protests in Minsk. According to a survey by the Minsk Academy of Sciences, nearly half of Belarusians want to remain independent of Moscow, while 36% favor a union with shared political institutions. Only around 7% favor full unification.
Well, in fact, I think the only way for the country to sort of remain where it is in terms of being a sovereign state is to continue a third way.
That's Yohani Prayerman, founder and director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations.
I mean, we'll understand what's going to happen if the country is swallowed by Russia, but essentially, if it were to sort of turn away from Russia and make this Western choice, the ultimate result would be the same, because the Russians have already demonstrated several times, including in Georgia and in Ukraine, that they are ready to react really aggressively and militarily to any further eastward movement of NATO infrastructure. And I think they basically associate NATO as the EU, so they don't make much difference between that. And that's why the only way is to somehow muddle through these current uncertainties, which stem out of the change in international system, and make sure that we diversify economically, but also in terms of foreign policy, while preserving as good a relationship with the Russians as possible. But of course, this is an extraordinary task. But again, I think I'm quite optimistic about that, because this is the only way the country can retain its sovereignty. And for the governing elite, it means that it's the only way for them to sort of continue being the governing elite of a sovereign state, rather than becoming some kind of a second-tier original elites within a huge Russia.
Back at the coffee shop, I asked Sakharan whether City Dog's audience leaned more toward Europe or Russia.
Я думаю, у нас либо достаточно высокие...
When City Dog audience, like the percent of those who are fond of Europe, it's pretty high. But same time, they have many who would like to stay, Eurosceptics, who would like to stay neutral. And there are few people who are really Russian, loyal,
Что Россия у нашей аудитории, она ассоциируется с, грубо говоря, с новой диктатурой, да.
The thing that City Dog audience doesn't really like is all that stuff about like dictatorship, the remnants of the Soviet past, and so on and so forth. So they do not like that at all.
They're ready to move on.
I hope so.
And so the country goes, stuck in its own kind of inertia. As we got up to leave and say our goodbyes, Sakharan recounted a favorite saying of his. "It's an interesting time in Belarus," he said, "but it's been an interesting time now for 25 years." You could say much the same about Detroit. I'm Sven Gustafsson. I hope you enjoyed this special edition of Daily Detroit and that maybe it piqued your interest about a little understood corner of the world. Before I go, I'd like to give my heartfelt thanks to Mykolai Anaschanka, Alexei Shuntov, Peter Slutsky, and everyone else at Press Club Belarus for being such excellent hosts and taking such good care of me. Thanks also to the U.S. Embassy in Minsk, which is due to get a new ambassador for the first time since 2008. I had a fantastic time in Minsk, and I'm so grateful I got to go. Finally, thanks to Cheyenne Nosarini for all her hard work editing this episode. And thanks to you for listening. Until next time, take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
Hey, I'm Jer Stays, and I am a host and producer of Your Daily Detroit. I'm here to tell you that in-depth podcast stories like what you just heard can only happen with your support. It's our members that make the show possible each and every weekday. Please consider becoming one for just a few bucks a month at patreon.com/dailydetroit. And thank you.